Today we're going to talk about the nation of Israel, and our purpose is to understand the Scripture. And one thing is for sure, if you want to know about the Scripture, you have to follow the nation of Israel, because all of this, all the way down through right here, this much is all Jewish. Then it turns a little bit Gentile in here, but not only about the last third. So if you want to know about the Bible, you have to be able to track the nation of Israel. So I'm going to talk today about Israel and things that we should know about it. And following the outline here, it says that it started with Abraham. So in Genesis 12 and verse 4, this is God saying to Abraham, I will bless them that bless you and curse him that curses you, and in you shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now we call that the Abrahamic covenant. And it's a covenant between God and His lineage for all time. And through that lineage, of course, the nations would all be blessed. And in what way? Well, the Messiah would come through that line. We also know that Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So all the children of Israel are the children of Jacob. So you can know that whenever you hear Israel, it's talking about a person and a lineage of a person. And of course we know that Jacob had sons. He had 12 sons, and generally, and those sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we know now that there's 12 entities that lived throughout the land of Israel. We know that in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, it says that they were God's chosen people. Now, that's a very interesting concept, because chosen for what? And chosen why? Well, chosen for great blessing? Well, maybe, but also chosen for great cursing. Because down through the years, if you want to see the extent of people being cursed, look at the nation of Israel. So I think, frankly, that they were chosen to help us understand how God operates with people. And it was a problem for me the last time I went to Tunisia, and these Muslim fellas thought they called me a Zionist because I kept talking about Israel. And then I said, well, you can't avoid Israel. I mean, it's all over the Bible, let's face it. And but my interest isn't to be pro anything. My interest is to have a biblical worldview. So when I see the world, I filter it through the Bible, and I see how it works. I'm not trying to be pro anything. In fact, I would like to be able to lay aside my American bias, because we think we're all that and we're not so hot. I'm a proud American and all that stuff, but I just don't take that too far. So it's very difficult for any of us to sort of set aside our own little personal filter and filter everything through the Scripture. But that's really what we should be doing, having what I call a biblical worldview. So God chose the children of Israel to show us how He operates with people, with man. When we got to the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, now we see Him operating as man. And we got to the book of Acts, and now we see Him operating through man. So the whole thing looks contrived, doesn't it? Looks like there might be a plan afoot. There's a discussion of the promised land in Genesis 15, verse 18, and it says, guess where it is? It starts from the great river in Egypt. What's that? The Nile. And runs all the way to the Euphrates River. Well, that's a lot of land. And that is not what we would call Israel today. But that is the promised land. And I saw a class one time on how the dimensions of Israel have changed over the centuries. And even in my lifetime, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and every time there's a war, the boundaries change. And it's quite interesting. But the Promised Land itself is from the Nile to the Euphrates, and that takes in a lot of people that are not Jews today, and a lot of land. In Genesis chapter 16, there's a built-in conflict. And in this built-in conflict, here's the way that goes. Sarah, Abraham's wife, said to him, you know what, we're beyond childbearing years. And why don't you go into my handmaiden, Hagar, and maybe it's God's will that you'll have a child by her. And so Abraham said, okay, that sounds good. So, we're going to have sex with my hand. And just went off dumbly and running ahead of God, impatient faith, and had a baby by this little Egyptian girl named Hagar. When she got pregnant, she hated Sarah for this. She said, what have you done to me? Oh my gosh, this old hairy Jew that made me go in and now I'm pregnant. Oh man, I didn't sign on for this, She was a servant girl. And as time went on, God said through an angel, listen, you go back and you honor your mistress, because Sarah kicked her out because these guys were fighting now. And Abraham said, you take care of that, honey. This was your idea, And the angel came and said to Hagar, you go back and honor your mistress, and I'm going to bless your seed. Well, what happened? Well, we have the seed of Abraham. I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and as the sand of the sea. So from Abraham, we have two ethnic groups. We have the Jews and the Muslims, or the Arabs today, and or the Semitic people. And one of the lines came from this union with Hagar. And so now we have a built-in conflict, because God said that I'm going to give this land to your seed. And they're both the seed. And they both claim the same land. And they both have a pretty good argument, except biblically we know that it has to go through Israel, but the Muslim people have a pretty good argument. In fact, they lived there for 7 centuries. They lived there for more than that, actually. They lived there for 14 centuries. No, they lived there for 15 centuries until the Jews came back into the Promised Land in 1948. And they said, okay, now it's our land again. You have to leave. And they go, what? We've lived here for 1,500 years. Where you want us to go? I don't care. It's our land. So you can understand why there's a conflict with all that. So it's a built-in conflict, and I say built-in because I frankly think it was built in by God to take us to the end time, because that's going to be the end time conflict, all about the land. We know that there was a guy named Joseph, and he was one of these sons, and what happened to Joseph was his sons, or his brothers, sold him into slavery. And they said, this guy Joseph, he's Dad's favorite, and it just seems like Dad favors him no matter what. And Joseph, in the Bible, by the way, there's 66 ways Joseph is like Jesus. You should do a study on that sometime. 66 ways that he mirrors the Savior, the Messiah. And one day Joseph had a dream. He told it to his brothers. They didn't like him anyway. And he said, you know what I saw in my dream? He said, I saw you guys bowing down to me. And they went, this kid, we got to get rid of this kid. That's too much. We've had too much with this guy. And so they thought they might kill him. Instead, they sold him into slavery to a caravan going down into Egypt. And when he got down into Egypt, it was a very, very, very terrible experience for Joseph. But, by the way, he was a prisoner. And one of the messages that I preached at the prison was, bloom where you're planted. And I went through the Bible and talked about all the Bible prisoners. Oh my gosh, they were all jailbirds. Daniel and Joseph and Jesus even, and Paul and Peter. And I mean, how many of them weren't prisoners, right? So one day, there was a famine in the land, and there's a famine in the region. And Jacob said, and by the way, who's Jacob? What's his other name? Israel, that's it. So Jacob said, go down to Egypt. I hear there's corn down in Egypt. And by the way, Joseph was down there now. He was the prime minister of agriculture. And he got put in charge of the whole thing because he was a good interpreter of dreams. And you know how that story goes. So now down in Egypt, his brothers showed up and said, we hear there's corn down here. They didn't know it was Joseph. There's corn. We'd like to buy some corn. And he's looking them over going, those are my brothers, the one that wanted me dead, the ones that sold me into slavery. And he was all dressed like an Egyptian, and they weren't expecting to see him anyway, you know. And so it turned out that when he finally said, look, I'm Joseph, they went, oh my gosh, what have we done? Oh man, this is bad. And he said, no. Something very wise, he said in Genesis 45 and verse number 5. He said, now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Wow. I mean, that's not natural to think that way. The natural thing is, I'm getting you guys. And I had older brothers. I know what I'm talking about. That's just He said, no, this is providential. So he really had providential thinking that God managed all this, you see. So Joseph said, bring the family down into Egypt. We got corn down here. Go get them, bring them to Egypt. Well, by that time, the family was 72 people. So here they came, and they all of the nation of Israel, 72 people, they came down into Egypt. And down in Egypt, God began to multiply them and bless them. And I mean, they were going crazy and having babies. And the Pharaoh down there, he got a little bit concerned about all this. He said, and by the way, they were down there for 430 years. Well, that's a long time. You know, go back in our country, 430 years. Where were we? We're just getting off the boat, right? And so 400, and now what we're almost 350 million people. Well, things happen over time, right? So here they are down in Egypt, and the new Pharaoh way down the line, it said there arose a king in the land that knew not Joseph. I don't know this Joseph and what kind of a guy. I mean, that's 400. I mean, that's a long time ago. You know, it's hard to remember the guys on the Mayflower. You can only maybe think of one or two. And all I know is he said these people are multiplying, and oh my gosh, if the enemy comes and makes an allegiance with these people, they'll conquer us from within. So they began to afflict the people and tried to keep them from having babies, even to the extent where they were killing all the male babies. And just killing the children. And during that time, a little kid was born named Moses. And he was put in the river and put in a little boat, and they're just trying to save his life. And we know the story of Moses, most of us. And Pharaoh's daughter took him into their house in the palace, and he became the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And after some time, Moses, of course, here's what happened. His sister was watching the boat, Moses' sister, and they saw these people come, and she said, oh, it's a Hebrew child. And so the sister, they took the baby, and the sister ran up and said, if you like, I can get you a Hebrew woman to come and nurse this baby for you. And they said, yes. So she ran and got her mother, which was Moses' mother. So Moses' mother became the nurse of Moses. How cool is that? Well, you know that she talked into his ear when he was a kid. Moses, no, you're not one of these people, you know. You're different, and I want you to know that we're from over here and they're from over there, even though we grew up in Pharaoh's house. And one day, with this thought in his mind, no doubt, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew guy. and said, "That's no good." And he looked this way, the Bible said, and he looked that way, and he went and he killed this Egyptian, and he hid him in the sand. And the next day he saw something else going on, and so he went up to the Egyptian. The Egyptian said, "You're going to kill me like you did the other guy yesterday?" He went, "You know about that? Oh man, I got to get out of here. This isn't going to work." So he left. So his first 40 years were spent in Egypt. His second 40 years were spent in the wilderness. And now he was a shepherd out there. And then God called him to come and deliver these people. He came back in and he took the children of Israel out of Egypt. And you know how the story goes. And they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And you say, well, why did they wander in the wilderness 40 years? And here's why. Because you can get Israel out of Egypt, but you can't get Egypt out of Israel. They were accustomed to that way. And everything they knew was Egyptian. All their worship had been Egyptian. All their food, all their ways, and all they knew was Egypt. And they wanted to go into the promised land, but not until they kind of purged the Egyptian thinking out. 40 years it took. And finally, under Joshua, they went back into the promised land. And in the promised land, they divided the land by tribes. Here's the tribe of Levi, here's the tribe of Naphtali, here's the tribe of Gad, here's the tribe of Manasseh, here's the tribe of whoever all the guys are. So they divided up the tribes so that each one had their own little place. Now, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that the kingdom was divided in 1 Kings chapter 12. Well, what happened was this king came along and politics started now, and one of them promised this and somebody else promised that, and so the kingdom was ultimately divided. The northern kingdom, which turned out to be 10 of the tribes, they were in the north, 2 of the tribes in the south, they divided the kingdom. So now we have the northern 10 tribes, and they're called Israel. The southern 2 tribes are called Judah. And that's the where we derive ultimately the word Jew, from the tribe of Judah. And so now we have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. And after that, the northern kingdom was really led away from God. And in 721 BC, God allowed the northern kingdom to be taken captive. And the enemy marched in and took them out of the land. Because he had always told them, this is it. When you read the book of Deuteronomy, here's what he said. By the way, Deuteronomy means the second law. And it wasn't the second law, it's just the second reading of the law. Because these people are going into the promised land. Well, who was the last time they heard the law? Well, it was 40 years ago. So it's time to hear it again. We're going into the land. And essentially he said this, God did. If you'll behave yourself and honor me and worship me, then I'll bless your land. And if you don't, you turn aside, I'm going to curse the land. Bless the land, curse the land. Bless the land, curse the land. And so they spent decades getting blessed, cursed, blessed, cursed, because they were fickle. They couldn't figure out just who they wanted to be when they grow up, I guess. So the northern kingdom was taken captive, 721 BC. The southern kingdom, which would have been the southern 2 tribes, also known as Judah, 601 BC. So what we know about the southern kingdom is they didn't learn from the northern kingdom that God doesn't like idolatry. And the southern kingdom, by the way, was the place where they housed the temple, where they had their temple worship. And the angel and God sent the hordes in from Assyria, from Babylon, and they came in and they began to kill. It was willy-nilly killed. And one of the things that they were told to do was start at the house of God, because that's where the problem's at. Start in the temple. Start in my sanctuary. As time went on, we see this religious evolution taking place. And in 2 Samuel chapter 8, we see the tribes being divided. And they're going to cross into the promised land now. And we have some tribes left over here. It's called the tribe of Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh were left over on the other side of Jordan when they finally crossed in and took the promised land after 40 years of wandering. We see that after a time that in Matthew chapter 23, their religious evolution took such a bad turn that Jesus even said to the highest of the spiritual ones, "You're a bunch of hypocrites." He said, "You can pass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you do, you make him twofold more a child of hell than yourselves." He said that to the priest. You're not only going to hell, but you're taking them to hell with you. And then he said, by the way, that yours shall be a greater damnation. So there's an interesting notion about there's degrees of punishment in hell, you see. Mark chapter 5, this is Jesus, and he had this experience with what we call the maniac of Gadara. Now, it's interesting to note that they were told that Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they were allowed to stay on the east side of Jordan, not to cross into the promised land because, hey, we got herds, there's grass out here, we're all set, what else do we need? And so we'll come help you fight when it's time to fight, but we're going to stay over here. And Moses said, okay, you can stay over there. Well, what happened? Well, as time went on, the issue that they forgot was that the tabernacle was on the west side. The temple worship was, God was over here, and they weren't. They were over there. And as time went on, Jesus marched into this place called Gadara, the maniac of Gadara, Gad, the Gadarenes, and he cast out some demons out of this demon-possessed kid. 2,000 sheep ran down the hill that day into the sea because the demons went into these pigs, and they got so upset with him that they disturbed their livelihood. By the way, pigs are forbidden in Israel, so God said, "I'll take care of two problems at once: the pigs and the demons." So he threw the demons into the pigs. Down the river they ran and killed themselves in the Sea of Galilee, probably. And the people of the Gadarenes just went, "Get out." And they invited Jesus, the Son of God, to leave because you've upset our apple cart. Well, that's how backslidden they got. That's what religion does. And I think the further you get away from your salvation, the colder your heart gets. Today we have something called the 1040 window. Do you know this? The 1040 window is 10 degrees above the equator to 40 degrees above the equator. That window going through the Middle East is the most needy place on the planet as far as the gospel is concerned. The 1040 window, 2/3 of the world's population lives there, and they're mostly lost. And the center of that is Israel. And I think today the statistics are that per capita there's more atheists in Israel than any place else on the planet, because they'll say things like, if there is a God, why would he let this happen to us? Now they forgot that all the history, but so off in the future now there's an experience. This is a prophet, Ezekiel, and what Ezekiel did was God let him see a valley, a vision of a valley of dry bones. And he saw all these bones just laying, just death and death valley like. And the prophet asked God, do you think these bones will ever live again? And he said, yes, these bones shall live again. Well, he was talking about the nation of Israel. And how, where, when, I mean, what happened to the nation of Israel? Well, we know that when they were crying, "Crucify Jesus," they said this, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." Well, about 40 years later, the Roman hordes marched in, leveled the city of Israel, Jerusalem, leveled the whole place, and took all the Jews captive. and every place that there was a tree, there was a Jew hanging on it. And under Nero, when he fiddled while Rome burned, he had a stake and a Jew tied to every stake with a tarred rope, and the ropes were lit, and they were just allowed to light the way, these burning Jews. I mean, and they didn't come back for almost 2,000 years. The dry bones, and they were scattered all over the planet, and we know what happened in World War II and over in Russia and in Germany and all that. And so the question was, shall they live again? And the answer was, they shall live again. And we see something going on in Isaiah chapter 11. And let me read this for you, because in Isaiah chapter 11, there's a prophecy. And Isaiah said this, and it shall come to pass. Now this is a key in the book of Isaiah. Whenever you're reading the book of Isaiah and you read in that day, well, it's talking about the end. In that day, well, that's the end. That's the end of time. In that day, it shall come to pass that the Lord shall set up his hand again, the second time, to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left. And then he names a whole bunch of places where they shall come up. In verse 12 it says, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So we know that the first time that return happened was in 536 BC. They were allowed to come back into the land, 536 BC. But it says here, and this is, by the way, this was prophesied 713 BC. So we know they're going to be in captivity. We know they're coming back. Because in one of our favorite verses, Jeremiah 29:11, where God said, I know the plans I have for you. Well, that's not a verse for you, that's a verse for Israel. Because in the verse right before it, it says, Judah and Jerusalem, you're going to go into captivity for 70 years. So they were taken into captivity 70 years, and they came back here. And then it says, verse 12, they're going to come back a second time. And when did that happen? That happened in May of 1948. In my lifetime, the Jews were returned to Israel for the second time. The United Nations declared Israel to be a state, and they gave Israel the land. And so now we have a prophecy being fulfilled, and guess what's going on? The dry bones coming back to life again. And they've been at this now for 50 years and doing quite well, thank you, if we can just keep the missiles from flying overhead. Now there are some things ought to be prophesied, and here's some prophecy. So I'm talking about Israel. I'm talking about what happened in Israel, but here's some very distinct prophecies regarding Israel. First of all, in Daniel chapter 9, a distinct prophecy in verse 24, 5, 6, when the Messiah would be born. I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, almost down to the day when Messiah would be born. And there's a calculation there that if I were a Jew, I would figure that calculation out, because it distinctly tells when Messiah. So if they're looking for Messiah, and by the way, one of the things it says in those verses is that he will be born, he will actually die before the temple is destroyed. Well, the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. So Messiah had to have died before that. So if you're a thinking Jew, you're going to say, whoop, I got this wrong. And it may be that prophecy in the last time that actually turns them. Who knows? He said, I'm going to make a new covenant. And the new covenant, of course, in Jeremiah 31, is through Jesus. I'm going to gather them, and they've been gathered. Their eyes are going to be opened. This is still off in the future. Isaiah 35, their eyes will be opened, and all at once they're going to say, he was the Messiah. Oh man, what have we done? Oh boy, we messed this up. And in a day, their eyes, I don't know how it's going to happen. Maybe there's a Jewish pope somewhere that's going to make some declaration. Jesus, in fact, was the Messiah. And they're all going to go, oh, of course. And I frankly think they're going to read the book of Hebrews. In fact, they're going to read my Deeper Bible Thinking book. And when they get to that chapter on Hebrews, they're going to go, of course, why didn't we see this? Okay. And they're going to end up knowing the Lord, and guess what's going to happen? They're going to be a light to the nations. So God's not done with Israel yet. They're going to be actually, what's the word? They're going to be enlisted. How's that? They're going to be enlisted to go and spread the gospel throughout the whole world during the tribulation period. And that's still off in the future. We know that they're going to dwell with Messiah. And Isaiah chapter 66 talks about it, and we can see it fulfilled in the book of Revelation. Now, in the near future, there's a couple of things that I'm going to point out. I'm on the last point here, and then we're going to be done. But we know that in Matthew 24, let me read this to you. It's kind of interesting. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Now, as far as they were, this is it. That's where God lives. And they said, come and see the temple. You've got to see this. This is incredible. And Jesus said to them, see these things? He said to them, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, remember what I told you about chapter 23? He called the religious people hypocrites. He said, you're going to hell. Now in 24, he says, and the temple's going to be torn down too. And they're going, who is this guy? I mean, he's against us. He's against our religion. He's against now he's going to tear the temple down. We're going to have to crucify this guy. That's all there is to it. But as he sat on the Mount of Olives, and I'd been there, that's just way cool, sitting on top of the Mount of Olives. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, saying, this is cool, tell us, when shall these things be? What should be a sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? I find that interesting, because they didn't know it, but they asked 3 questions. They only thought they asked one. If the temple's torn down, that's got to be the end of the world. So they really asked 3 questions. When shall these things be? A sign of your coming. And I don't know how they knew there was going to be another coming. And of the end of the world. 3 questions. So in Matthew chapter 24, he sets out to describe what that's going to be like. And one thing that's very important in verse 15, he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and by the way, that's Daniel chapter 9. He said, when you see that stand in the holy place, this guy, it's the Antichrist, then let him that be in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop come not down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him that's in the field return back to take his clothes. Woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither in the Sabbath day. And then shall be great tribulation, such as was not seen since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor shall ever be. And except those days shall be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So it's talking about in a period of time that's yet in the future. We call it the Great Tribulation period, and we can do a study on that sometime. But it's after the rapture of the church takes place. It's probably midway through the tribulation period when we enter something called the Great Tribulation period. And the thing that signals it is when Antichrist sets up his throne in the temple in Jerusalem, which, by the way, doesn't even exist today. So there's a temple that has to be built. Now, I've been to Israel, and there's a place called the Temple Institute. And what they have done in this Temple Institute, they know they're going to build a temple. So what they've done is they have prefabbed an entire temple. and tab A into slot B, and all I got to do is get the spot, and they're going to go and reassemble it, and it shouldn't take a week and a half to throw that together. So that's still off in the future. We also know that that's going to when that happens, there's an impediment there right now, and it's called the Mosque of Omar, and it has to be torn down in some way. And when that happens, all hell's going to break loose, and it's going to be very interesting. But when we get to Revelation chapter 7, this is still off in the future. Mosque of Omar, or the Dome of the Rock is another name for it. And Revelation chapter 7, it says this. And by the way, after chapter 4, that's when the rapture occurs, probably, chapter 4, verse 1. But now in chapter 7, we see these people, Jews, 144,000, that are going throughout the world now. They have a seal on their foreheads that they can't be hurt. And there's 12,000 of the tribes of Judah, and 12,000 of the tribes of Reuben, 12,000 of the tribes of Gad and Asher and Naphtali and Manasseh, all of these, list them all. 144,000 Jews going throughout the world in some way, shape, or form, and they're evangelizing. They're convincing the world that Jesus, in fact, is the Savior of the world, not just the Messiah of the Jews. But that's still off in the future. So here's what I'm saying to you, that if you want to understand the Scripture, man, you got to understand you got to understand Israel. And if you don't have a good grasp on Israel, then you're going to miss a lot. And I say watch Israel in the news. Every time you hear something about it, pay attention to what's going on, because it has everything to do with the future of the world, what's happening in the nation of Israel. All right, God bless.